Okay, guys, so welcome to Unit 3, Outcome 2, and we begin that by looking at the immune system and disease, which is very relevant for the times that we're living in. So we begin to look at basically by looking at what antigens are and how they're involved in the body recognising disease, and then move on to look in detail about how parts of the immune system work to fight disease. Okay? So the main things we're focusing on today are what disease is, which is very simple, what antigens are, and what pathogens are. Okay? So obviously, diseases are just things that affect the metabolic function of an organism. Something that makes the organism not be able to function properly is what disease is. Some diseases are non-communicable, so they cannot pass from person to person. So for that, think things like, diabetes, most mental illnesses, most cancers, they're not communicable from person to person. But then we have communicable or infectious diseases that are caused by pathogens, okay? We'll look at what pathogens means later, and just in general in this topic, we want to focus on diseases caused by pathogens for the most part. We'll look a little bit about cancers as part of this topic, but for the most part, we're looking at communicable diseases and how they are transmitted and how the body responds to them. Now, I've just drawn here, I've drawn a regular body cell, okay? And all around that regular body cell, there are these little bumps, and those bumps are meant to represent small protein structures on the outside of the cell, and we refer to those protein structures as antigens. Then down here, I've got a pathogen, a disease that can cause, an organism that can cause disease, and that's also got antigens around the side of it. So these antigens, okay, these little protein bumps, are basically like an identity card for the organism. So when they're on the cells of the organism, that's like an identity card saying this is part of the body, it's meant to be here. So when your immune cells come across this regular body cell and see those antigens, they detect them as self-antigens, meaning they're meant to be there, and that's fine, the immune system won't do anything. Whereas when the immune system encounters these non-self antigens, found on the pathogen here, that can initiate an immune response. So think of antigens as basically like identity cards for a cell. They may identify it as being part of the body, meant to be there, or as not part of the body, which will initiate an immune response, which we'll look at in a few lessons' time. Okay, so that is what is meant by an antigen. One of the proteins that works as an identifying molecule for the cell. Looking at some types of antigen, we want to focus on major histocompatibility complexes, which we normally abbreviate to MHCs. So what we refer to as MHC1s are found on all of your body cells, with the exception of red blood cells. Your red blood cells have got something different going on. If you've heard of the blood groups like A, B, O, that links to what is or isn't on the outside of red blood cells. I might touch on that in another lesson, but they're the only ones that don't have these MHC1s. MHC2 molecules are only found on immune cells, so B and T lymphocytes, and I've written some lymphocytes, that's a mistake. It should have said some phagocytes, okay? Which is just another type of immune cell. I'll correct it now. There we go. So let's try that again. MHC2 molecules, they're found on some immune cells, mostly B and T lymphocytes, but a few phagocytes. We'll look at what B and T lymphocytes and phagocytes are over the next few lessons, so don't worry about that too much for now. Just know that MHC2 molecules, a type of antigen, are found on some immune cells. And they can also work as antigen-presenting cells, which means they can present antigens from pathogens, things that cause disease, to other immune cells. Again, that's something we'll look at probably in a few lessons' time, but that's just what I mean by that when I say they're antigen-presenting cells. Now, this is important. Don't get antigens confused with antibodies or pathogens. It's got the anti of antibodies and the gens from pathogens, and they're obviously all linked to immunity, so it can be confusing. But just remember, antigens are protein markers on the outside of cells that mark it as being part of the organism or not part of the organism. Antibodies are immunoglobulins, basically proteins involved in the immune system. We'll look at a few of them later on in this topic. And pathogens are organisms capable of causing disease. Okay? And we're about to look at the main types of pathogen. And pathogens can come in many different forms. We're going to focus on 6 forms today, 2 of which are non-cellular, meaning not made of cells, 2 of which are unicellular, so they're made of only 1 cell per organism, and 2 of them are multicellular, which means they're obviously made of many different types of many different cells. So let's start on prions. Prions are a non-cellular pathogen. These are absolutely tiny. They're less than 15 nanometers. Now, to give you an idea of how small a nanometer is, if you imagine a millimeter on a ruler, there we go. Imagine a millimeter on a ruler. Imagine dividing that space into 1,000, and 1,000th of a millimeter would be a micrometer. Now take that micrometer and divide that by 1,000. That would be a nanometer. So prions are only about 15 nanometers long at their biggest. They can be even smaller than that. So they are really, really tiny things. They're not even organisms, just really, really tiny molecules. So what they are is they are proteins that have misfolded in a certain way, and that can cause them to go on to make other proteins that they touch also misfold. And over time, that just destroys the tissue. So there's a couple of proteins have folded wrong, but they touch other proteins and make them fold wrong as well, and that causes other proteins nearby to fold wrong as well, overall leading to a situation where huge, huge holes in the tissue that it's infecting get made. And unfortunately, the tissue that prions tend to affect is often the brain tissue or nerve tissue around the brains. They're incurable, they're heat resistant, they are always fatal, they are terrifying. Fortunately, they are extremely, extremely rare, but they are obviously extremely serious as well. Probably the most famous sort of prion disease is bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Let's try that again. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy. There we go. I normally refer to it as mad cow disease, which is a lot easier to say, and most people do as well. But that disease, that prion disease, is present in some cows. It's very rare there, but there was actually an outbreak in Europe in the 1990s. And interestingly, as a result of that, I'm not allowed to give blood in Australia. Because basically, prion diseases can take a long time to come into action, and theoretically, there's a chance that anyone that ate beef in Europe in the 1990s could have been exposed to it. It's very unlikely. I doubt I have. Fingers crossed. But yeah, because of that, people that were exposed to meat in Europe in the 1990s cannot give blood in Australia in case they do have the prion for mad cow disease in their system, and can pass it on to people they give blood to. So yeah. So prions, really scary, but very rare, fortunately. So they're non-cellular, and they're just a misfolded protein. Then we've got viruses, and obviously a virus is what's causing the world to be all unusual at the moment. So they're a very small strand of either DNA or RNA. If it's DNA, they're called an adenovirus, and those are the more common sorts of viruses. If they have RNA, they're a retrovirus. And that's contained inside a protein capsule. They don't have any organelles or membranes, so they're not counted as a cell. And they're really, really small as well. Generally, at their smallest, about 20 nanometers, so a little bit bigger than a prion, but still very small. The absolute biggest ones are maybe half a micrometer. So remember, a micrometer is 1,000th of a millimeter. The biggest viruses are about half of that. So not quite as small as a prion, but still very small. Viruses require a host to reproduce in. They can't replicate when they're not in a host. So what they do is they get into cells, they release their genetic material, and they use the host's machinery, the host cell machinery, like their endoplasmic reticulums, their Golgi apparatus, to make new viruses. Those viruses will then burst out of the cell, often killing it, and infect new cells. So they cause disease basically by damaging cells as they do that. So as they take over a cell, use it to make new viruses, and then burst out of it, that will kill the cell, and then they'll go into a new one and infect that as well. They are, like I said, I've got a very simple drawing of one there, just with the protein capsule and then the DNA inside of it. Just put there, they occasionally have a lipid envelope that goes around the capsule as well, but it's a very, very simple structure, whatever's going on with them. Okay, very simple things. Again, I nearly said organisms, but we don't count them as organisms because they're not alive. But yeah, that's viruses for you. Next, we've got bacteria, which are unicellular prokaryotes. So by prokaryotes, I mean they are simple, they are small, they can get about as big as 2 micrometers. Generally, yeah, they're around 2 micrometers on the upper scale. They've got no membrane-bound organelles. Most bacteria are harmless, but some of them, as they grow, release toxins, and toxins can damage your cells and make you unwell. So the bacteria that produce toxins are the ones that cause disease. And also some of them, as they grow, take resources from your body. So most bacteria aren't a problem, but some of them release toxins as they grow and then also take resources away from your body. The other unicellular organism to know about are called protozoans, which are eukaryotic. Just one of those weird biology things. It's a bit confusing because they're eukaryotic, but they're called protozoans, which may make you think they're prokaryotic, but that's just a weird biologist thing. They are eukaryotic organisms, and they are unicellular. So being eukaryotic, they are much larger than bacteria. They can be around 20 to 50 micrometers, sometimes even bigger in rare circumstances. And they've got a nucleus, they've got membrane-bound organelles, they sometimes have chloroplasts, a bit like plants do. They are still unicellular though, so there's only one of them. And they cause illness in similar ways to bacteria, so releasing toxins and stuff. And they can be transmitted by what we call vectors. So vectors are just organisms that carry the protozoans. I'll talk about them a little bit later. And then down at the bottom, just a little drawing of both of them. So the bacteria on the left, which is much smaller than the protozoan on the right. Yeah, you can see that bacteria just has a coil of DNA, while the protozoan has a nucleus. Okay, and our last two, which are both multicellular. So first of all, we're going to talk about fungi. Fungi tend to be ectoparasites, meaning they are parasites that tend to grow on the outside of the body, usually the skin, occasionally membranes in the throat and stuff, which are pretty much counted as outside the body. They just grow in sort of environments with lots of moisture. So as they grow, they absorb nutrients. They're very rarely dangerous, to be honest, just irritating and gross. If you want to see that, you can, if you really want to, maybe Google advanced athlete's foot. I recommend you don't, it'll be disgusting, but that's an example of a fungal disease. It's pretty disgusting, but it's not actually very dangerous. Like I said, not many fungal diseases are. They tend to be only dangerous for immunocompromised people. So maybe people undergoing chemotherapy, people who've got AIDS, people that we say are immunocompromised. They could be at risk of being severely ill from fungi, but for the majority of the population, they're irritating and disgusting, but not particularly dangerous. And finally, we've got worms, which are multicellular animals. Very small animals, but they are still animals. So usually we're talking about tapeworms, which have got a very, very simple structure. You can see at the bottom, they're just a flat worm. They've basically got a mouth and anus. They're pretty much full of eggs otherwise, with a very simple reproductive and digestive system. So they are very, very, very simple organisms, very simple animals. But yeah, so their eggs often get spread through contaminated water. So it may be water contaminated by an animal's droppings, it may be water contaminated by human droppings. But if water gets contaminated by an organism that's been defecating out the eggs of the worms, that can get into people that drink that. And these cause disease by taking resources from the body and also by damaging tissues where they're growing. and also by laying their eggs in the body and basically clogging up parts of them, especially tapeworms in the intestine. If they lay eggs in your intestines, many of them will end up getting excreted from you, but a lot of them just sort of stay there and take up space. And yeah, again, worms, pretty disgusting. Okay, so that overviews our 6 main types of pathogen. So we've got our 2 non-cellular ones, prions, which are misfolded proteins, and viruses, which are just DNA or RNA in a protein coat. Then we've got our 2 unicellular pathogens. So we've got our bacteria that are prokaryotic and our protozoans that are eukaryotic. Both of them produce toxins as they grow, damaging the body. And then we've got our 2 multicellular pathogens. We've got our fungi and we've got the worms. Just as an example of each one, so prions, the example would be mad cow disease, which I couldn't pronounce earlier. Viruses, loads of examples, but COVID-19 is the very topical one at the moment, which is an example of a coronavirus. Bacteria, cholera, which you may have heard of, it causes severe diarrhea. That's caused by a bacterium. Protozoans, so there's something called Plasmodium, which ends up causing malaria. So that's a protozoan. So mosquitoes themselves don't actually cause malaria, but what they do is the Plasmodium uses mosquitoes as a vector. And by a vector, we mean it's the Plasmodium uses it to get passed from one organism to another. So malaria is picked up from, the Plasmodium is picked up from maybe another animal by a mosquito, and then the mosquito bites a human and transmits the Plasmodium that causes malaria to the human. So malaria is ultimately a protozoan disease. For fungi, I mentioned athlete's foot. I strongly recommend not Googling it, but yeah. And then worms, bilharzia is quite a common worm-based infection, very common in sub-Saharan Africa. Mild symptoms, it causes diarrhea and stuff, and more severely over time, it can be extremely damaging. Anyway, that overviews the main types of pathogen. Remember, by pathogen, we mean something that causes disease. Don't get it confused with an antigen, which is a marker on cells that says whether or not they're part of an organism. Just to end with, I've got 2 what am I's. Just to make it clear, where I say number 1, that's for one of the things, and for number 2, it's another. So they're not 5 things talking about the one thing. We've got the 2 answers down at the bottom here that I've covered up for now. So number 1, we're saying it is made from cells, we're saying it is multicellular, and we're saying it doesn't produce eggs. So what would that be? And number 2 is not made from cells, but does have DNA. So maybe pause this quickly and try and work out what they'd be.